Welcome, everybody, to our next panel. This session will discuss the idea of global celebrity and Black Atlantic movement across the diaspora. And we've got three wonderful speakers here whose work interconnects in really interesting ways. We have Professor Babacar who is the author of many works on the Black Atlantic and on Black diaspora lives, and writings that centre African and the travel of Afrocentric, Senegalese, Wolof, and Islamic cultural practices across the Atlantic. Including in this work is his wonderful book, which many of us draw on for these things, The Trickster Comes West, Pan-African Influence in Early Diasporic Narratives, and Black Cosmopolitanism and Anti-Colonialism, Pivotal Movements, and many other chapters and articles that are very pertinent to our concerns as we think about Equiano as a site for these lives. Cassander Smith is Associate Professor at the University of Alabama and is currently the editor of Early American Literature, the Journal. She is outgoing president of the Early Caribbean Society and has written copiously on American Black lives, including two monographs, Race and Respectability in Early Black Atlantic and Black Africans in the British Imagination, English Narratives of the Early Atlantic World. So you can see how much these scholars' works connect together. Omar Miranda is Associate Professor at the University of San Francisco and specialises in the literatures of the 18th and 19th centuries, especially their transnational, global, and diasporic contexts. He's currently working on a book that tracks the origins and rise of the culture of global celebrity in the Romantic period, so that's so important for how we're thinking about Equiano and other figures. He is currently the Vice President for Academic Outreach at the Keats Shelley Association, who are our co-sponsors for our whole event. So thank you for the work you've done to support this event, Omar. He is the editor of two really important books, Percy Shelley for Our Times with Kate Singer, and an edition of The Last Man, an abridged teaching edition of Mary Shelley's important novel. And he's currently working on a figure that he's going to talk about today, who is Francisco de Miranda, whose life connects with Equiano's in many, many interesting ways. So thank you. I think Cassie's going to start first.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kerry, for the introductions, and thanks to Kerry and the Early Caribbean Society for putting this all together. Really excited to be engaged in dialogue today with both of you. So what I'm going to talk about, these are some observations that started in one of the chapters from my last book on race and respectability, and I'm just, thinking more deeply about these issues. So I'll just talk through this, and then, hopefully we'll have some time for dialogue in the end. So on the face of it, Equiano's story in his narrative is your quintessential up by the bootstraps narrative of social, economic, and racial progress. He's captured and enslaved when he's 11, just to kind of recap some of the biographical highlights. He's sold to various enslavers on the East Coast and in the Caribbean. He purchases his freedom for 40 pounds sterling when he turns 21, and he does this by saving up the money that he's earned from trading goods throughout the Caribbean. As a free man, he continues to earn a living through overseas trade and travels around the world to Italy, Spain, Turkey, the Arctic. Along the way, he converts to Christianity. He serves a brief stint in 1786 as commissary for the Sierra Leone resettlement plan that relocated hundreds of Black Africans from London and later Nova Scotia to the coast of Sierra Leone. And he advocates, of course, for the abolishment of the slave trade. In 1792, he marries an English woman. They have two daughters. He dies in 1797, and at that point, he has accumulated enough wealth to leave behind a small fortune that is inherited by one surviving daughter. By most contemporary standards, Equiano, he lived a successful life. In the narrative he writes about that life, he shapes it as a story about social and economic elevation with a particular emphasis on his character, education, and industriousness. And today we would call this a kind of respectability. He transforms from a commodity into a human subject, an individual who owns property of his own. He I'm sorry, the details of his life, which I, of course, just laid out in brief, and the way he crafts those details into a best-selling autobiography contribute to his celebrity status. But in thinking about Equiano as a celebrity, as a global figure, as this gathering is inviting us to do, we can and we should think past the constructed narrative of his life, or maybe more precisely, read that narrative against the grain. What conditions must be in place to create a global Equiano, a celebrity? Part of the way I answer this question is by turning to the margins of Equiano's interesting narrative. There, at the margins, we get accounts of other Black lives. So these are Black Africans who do not rise to the status of celebrity, who do not experience the global reach of Equiano, and whatever afterlives they have are there by virtue of existing at the margins of Equiano's narrative. I think, for example, about his kid sister. Equiano was first kidnapped alongside a sister who, a day later, was, in his words, torn from him, leaving him in a state of distraction not to be described. Several months later, he encounters this sister again on the seacoast, and this is before he's, stuffed into the cargo hold of a ship and suffers through the Middle Passage. So upon seeing each other, according to Equiano, neither of us could speak, but for a considerable time clung to each other in mutual embraces, unable to do anything but weep. The reunion, however, is short-lived, right? The very next day, they are pulled apart again, and they're separated permanently, and we know that Equiano comes on across the Atlantic. As an adult narrator, reflecting back on this moment, Equiano writes grimly of the fate he presumes was his sister's lot. He fears that her, quote, youth and delicacy long ago fell victim to the violence of the African trader, the pestilential stench of a Guinea ship, the seasoning of the European colonies, and the lash and lust of a brutal and unrelenting overseer. He does not imagine a narrative of uplift like his own. Black women, as Equiano notes repeatedly throughout his text, were subjected to particular sexual atrocities, in addition to other modes of physical and psychological abuse. For a moment in his narrative, he breaks from the narrative to address his sister directly, and he says, though you were early forced from my arms, your image has been always riveted in my heart, from which neither time nor fortune have been able to remove it. He prays for his sister's soul, quote, to that heaven which protects the weak from the strong. Through his sister, Equiano acknowledges implicitly the exceptionalism of his own fate. Because he is gendered male, he finds himself in situations that enable him to take advantage of mobility, apprenticeships, and mercantilism, opportunities less likely to have been available to enslaved women. His sister, who is never named in the text, reminds readers of the anomalous quality of Equiano's own outcome, even as she represents the familial ruptures wrought by the slave trade. So that's one example of the Black Africans who people the margins of Equiano's narrative. Another example happens in chapter 5 with a person who he describes as his countryman. This man, Equiano explains, quote, was very industrious and by his frugality managed to save up enough money from hiring out his time to buy a boat that he could rent out to move cargo around the islands. This man endeavors to carve out a space for himself in the West Indies market. His efforts, importantly, do not result in a narrative of uplift, even though he, like Equiano, embodies the core tenets of, respectability. He's hardworking and he's thrifty. As property who owns property, however, he is thwarted by his white counterparts. Like, for example, on one of the governors of the island who rents this man's boat to transport sugar. Rather than compensating the man for the use of the boat, this unnamed governor, quote, would not pay the owner a farthing, understanding it to be a Negro man's boat. Adding insult to injury, The man is unable to find redress with his own owner, who becomes enraged upon discovering that his, quote, property claims to own property. According to Equiano, this black boat owner, quote, was damned very heartily by his master, who asked him, how dare any of his Negroes have a boat? Through examples like this, Equiano points to the inability of Black Africans to assert property ownership. This boat owner enters the public market sphere. However, he cannot participate fully in that sphere because his legal status marks him as invisible or a subperson beyond the protections of a social contract. Equiano makes it clear that this one example is representative of the ways in which slavery in the West Indies denies Black Africans financial self-determinacy. It is a common practice, he says, in the West Indies for men to purchase slaves, though they have not plantations themselves, in order to let them out to planters and merchants at so much apiece by day. These enslavers claim sole right to the wages and allot what allowance they choose out of this produce of daily work. It is often the case, Equiano argues, that the allowance is scant or non existent. The observations here matter because they illustrate the extent to which enslaved Black Africans exist outside of the bounds of a social contract, a state of existence resulting not from an inherent depravity, because again, the boat owner was frugal and hardworking, but instead from social and legal codes. And then I'll share one more example, a third example. And this is one where he describes his economic ventures with a companion on the island of St. Croix. The two men team up to sell bags of produce, specifically oranges and limes. They have 3 bags total, and 2 of the bags belong to Equiano. The third bag belongs to his companion, and Equiano says of this produce that it constituted his, quote, whole stock, which was about 12 bits worth. As soon as they arrive at St. Croix, 2 white men, sailors, steal their bags. In a desperate attempt to retrieve their goods, Equiano and this companion pursue the men, quote, begging of them to return the fruit. According to Equiano, we told them these 3 bags were all we were worth in the world. They plead in vain. The men refused to return the bags, promising instead to beat Equiano and his partner. They even took sticks to beat us, Equiano says. When they failed to retrieve their property from the men, Equiano and his partner appealed to the men's commanding officer, but, quote, obtained not the least redress. He answered the complaints only by a volley of imprecations against us and immediately took a horsewhip in order to chastise us, so that we were obliged to turn out much faster than we came in. In a last desperate attempt to salvage their trading venture, Equiano and his partner go back to the men who stole their bags and, quote, begged and besought them again and again. Finally, a couple onlookers intervene on their behalf to help them retrieve 2 of the 3 bags, the 2 belonging to Equiano. This enables Equiano finally to make a profit on the sale of his portion of the fruit. As an act of mercy, he splits the profit with his companion, who otherwise would have walked away empty-handed. Afterwards, to minimize his risk, Equiano mobilizes the authority and social visibility of his captain, who he says frequently used to take my part and get me my right when I have been plundered or used ill by these tender Christians. Because Black Africans are not protected by law, Equiano's economic survival in part depends upon the goodwill of his white associates. The survival of his business companion in the scene above is even more precarious, as he has to rely on Equiano's compassion. This unnamed companion is one to whom Equiano refers earlier in the narrative as a, quote, poor Creole Negro, who bemoans his enslaved state mainly because it undermines all his efforts toward self-possession. According to Equiano, the companion is an industrious man who spends his days working for a master and then employs his scant leisure hours fishing in order to earn a few coins for himself. Like Equiano and the boat owner discussed earlier, this fisherman is subject to the whims of white buyers who sometimes compensate him properly for his fish, but often do not. His situation is exacerbated by a capricious master who sometimes intervenes on the man's behalf, but who is just as likely to claim the man's fish and profits for his own. In a state of hopelessness, the man muses to Equiano one day, sometimes when a white man take away my fish, I go to my master and he get me my right. And when my master by strength take away my fishes, what me must do? I can't go to anybody to be righted. Then I must look up to God Almighty in the top for right. This man's struggles, rather than Equiano's relative successes, are the common fate of Black Africans in the early Americas. Equiano's narrative is not simply a project of self-construction then, or in a modern day colloquialism, a form of brand management. He is writing just as much for other Black folks as he is for himself. There is a good deal of irony in the plight of Equiano and his companions. It is the condition of enslavement that both shapes their struggles and also exposes Equiano to the experiences that he then molds into a narrative of upward mobility. For sure, Equiano is not an example of what's possible. He's an example of the impossible. He is the exception that proves the rule. And he makes this point in his narrative through representations of his encounters with and observations of other Black Africans who do not experience a similar level of success. Notably, Equiano shifts between identifying with the struggles of other Black Africans and reporting on those struggles as an allied but detached observer. The Black African figures who suffer at the margins of Equiano's narrative and Equiano himself point to the insidious nature of self-made narratives. Black Africans experience a social exclusion enacted through law and custom that stifles their potential, preventing them from mimicking Equiano's rise and justifying Equiano's status as exceptional. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll go, right? It's my turn. Thank you, Cassie. That was amazing, and I see so many overlaps already with what I'm going to be discussing. So I look forward to our discussion. I have a slide show, so my talk will be visual as much as verbal. Let me share that. Can you all see that? Okay, great. Well, I was able to find this mural. It's in London near Fitzroy Square. I think it's in Fitzroy Square, and it has Equiano in it and the figure I'm going to be talking about today, Miranda, and it was done in 2000. I forget the name of the artist right now, but um, apparently Miranda and Equiano lived together in the same part of London, which is why this mural was created. Okay, let me begin. My talk is called Unprecedented Celebrity in the Age of Revolution, and I want to say thank you to Kerry and the rest of the Global Equiano organizers for this incredible invitation. I'm really delighted to participate here. My research has focused in large part on, excuse me, I wanted to say that if this had an epigraph, I would choose this quote from Fanon: "In the world through which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself." Um, my research has focused in large part on Francisco de Miranda, the Venezuelan revolutionary who achieved an unprecedented form of celebrity in his lifetime. My remarks here will focus on that distinctive status, the trouble with classifying him in our multilingual and multidisciplinary scholarship, and my journey to find the pertinent theoretical frames for his celebrity. Miranda lived in exile across 3 continents for 27 years of his relatively long life. He is known today as the precursor of the Spanish American liberation movement, as well as the precursor to Simón Bolívar. He fought in and supported 3 Atlantic revolutions, the American, the French, and the Spanish American. And he almost became the person to prevent the Haitian Revolution from happening. A devout Anglophile, he established his home from home in London on Grafton Street, where, as I have argued elsewhere, a coherent Spanish-American independence campaign was born. His life, however, ended much like Toussaint Louverture's. He died in a prison in Europe before seeing the full extent of his homeland's transformation into an independent nation state. In my book In Progress, I am contending that Miranda is one of the world's first celebrities, not only because of the extensive reputation that he established and the eminent individuals he befriended across hemispheres, but also because he lived during the media transformations that changed the industry itself. In certain respects, his life mirrored the upward social mobility of Equianos, as Cassie was just saying, even though Miranda was never enslaved, to be clear. I want to begin my talk with a story not often told. In September 1784, Miranda met Phyllis Wheatley Peters in Boston just shortly before her death. And this, incredibly so, Cassie, is kind of like Equiano's nod to his sister and other marginal figures. I can't believe the parallels here. The moment highlights a particular disparity between them, Wheatley's unfortunate decline and his exponential upswing or uplift, as you say, Cassie, on the social and political scene in the early US Republic. And I'll give you my translation of this quote. Phyllis Wheatley, a Black slave who, as a child, came to this country came to this city from the coast of Guinea. Her owner gave her a modest education, and both her prose and poetic compositions were published. She then went to England and earned her admiration. Oops, excuse me. Afterwards, she returned to suffering from the same neglect that talented people suffer everywhere. She finally married a sagacious Black man named Peters, with whom she had several children, and today is dying in indigence. Her case shows how, no matter one's form or appearance, the rational being is everywhere the same. Even though she endured the cruelest laws of restraint, the cultivation of the most exalted pleasures are preserved in this Black being. In his journal, Miranda is reading himself through her situation, noting the injustice of Wheatley's condition. Despite her race, her experiences, and her gender, she belongs to a select class of talented beings found throughout the world. Yet ironically, having returned to the early US Republic of, quote, possibility, Wheatley finds herself in a dead end. Unlike Miranda, she lacks the privileges that have permitted his climb up the American social and economic ladder. To be clear, Miranda was born in Caracas and was of mixed Creole and Canary Islander heritage. As a Hispanic born in the Americas, he was considered a Creole, but legally he was white, even though today he'd likely be considered brown and a minority. Such a Creole classification was looked down upon, however, by peninsular Spaniards. In his youth, he was also belittled by the local elite in Caracas and always wanted to find a way to climb the social ladder. These origins certainly gave him something to prove, perhaps throughout the rest of his life. The 2 years that led to Miranda's encounter with Wheatley are truly extraordinary. He landed in the Carolinas in 1783 as an unknown foreigner who was actually a fugitive on the run from the Spanish. And that's a long story I'm not going to tell right now. And by the end of his early American tour, he was dining with the most eminent and illustrious of the young independent nation. He may have been one of the first to live out the, quote, American dream, because by the end of his upward route from the Carolinas to Massachusetts, he was dining with George Washington in Philadelphia, planning the emancipation of a whole continent with Alexander Hamilton in New York City, and meeting John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Phyllis Wheatley in Boston. He accomplished this fascinating social climb by mastering the art of procuring and deploying letters of introduction. He set foot on US soil with a couple of letters from his former mentor in the Spanish Imperial Army, and through his atypical practice of typical male genres, travel writing and the grand tour, he turned his original letters of endorsement into a surplus of esteemed recommendations and transnational alliances. Let me just put it this way. In 1784, he marched into what was to become Yale University in Connecticut. And its president at the time, Ezra Stiles, gave Miranda a campus tour. When they got to the library, Miranda told Stiles that the Yale collection was mediocre at best. It was, quote, nothing special. In his personal journals, however, Ezra Stiles wrote approvingly of Miranda, labeling him as a learned man and a flaming son of liberty who has a perfect acquaintance with the policy and history of all Spanish America. The self-proclaimed bibliophile Miranda was able to insult and curry favor simultaneously. Now that is a gift. After his time in the US, he traveled to England, embarking shortly thereafter on the rest of his grand tour, which took him to Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Russia, the Scandinavian countries, and elsewhere. In 1786, when he went to St. Petersburg, he was able to convince Catherine the Great, the empress in whose court he resided for several months, to give him a monthly stipend and Russian diplomatic protection in all her embassies around the world. She basically said to him, "Sure, my darling Hispanic lover, take a Russian Imperial Army uniform too." And in England thereafter, he regularly wore his new attire, in fact, and was mistaken for Russian identity. Miranda is the only individual from the Americas to be recognized in the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. His name is here on the second column, the fifth name down. And here I have a picture of myself from 2019 right in front of the Northern Pillar. When England refused to support his plan for a British-backed continental uprising against Spain, even though William Pitt, the prime minister, was also giving the Venezuelan a substantial allowance, Miranda turned to France. There, many of the early Girondist leaders became his avid fans. They convinced Miranda to become an army general of the French military. And though Miranda was ultimately charged with plotting against the French Republic, he was absolved. In fact, he was imprisoned 3 times during the Revolution, and 2 of them occurred during the Jacobin takeover and the Reign of Terror. Miranda survived each time, avoiding the guillotine and becoming a symbol of revolutionary hope. And the English writer Helen Maria Williams writes about this very thing, Miranda surviving the French Revolution. The lawyer that represented Marie Antoinette, for instance, also represented Miranda. I mean, that's just incredible. And the attorney, as we know, failed miserably to exonerate the former queen, but succeeded in absolving the Venezuelan, who managed not only to get Thomas Paine and Joel Barlow to testify on his behalf, but also to have Mary Wollstonecraft visit him, and William Godwin sent him an early copy of Political Justice. Miranda's symbolism of hope in France cannot be overstated. As the pulse of the nation turned increasingly ethnocentric and xenophobic, here we have a hero who's a foreigner and an outsider. In the early 1790s, in fact, the Girondists, especially Jacques-Pierre Brissot, wanted to make him the governor of Saint-Domingue, what would become Haiti, because of Miranda's social currency and what Brissot thought would be Miranda serving as a racial intermediary between the white and black populations on the island. His capacity to maneuver among peoples and across places was something that Lord Byron later picked up on. Part of my research, in fact, tracks how Byron based his most famous poem, Don Juan, on Miranda's life story. And this is something that has not been argued before in earnest. It makes sense. In the poem, Byron transforms the legendary Don Juan character into another kind of global legend, an anglicized Hispanic hero whose surname in Byron's hands is Moncada, one who also becomes an exotic celebrity through military combat. Juan visits Greece, Turkey, prior to residing for several months in Catherine the Great's court. He returns to England as a cultural emissary, where people cannot determine whether he's Spanish or Russian. Does this sound familiar? Byron also wrote in his letters that after the English cantos, he would have taken Juan to scenes during the French Revolution, and Byron died in Greece before he could realize producing this part of the poem. Here I have some slides to show you the connections here. These are Juan's travels throughout the poem. Here are Miranda's travels from 85 to 89, and here are both travels side by side. I want to reflect on the Mirandist methodology or the Mirandology a bit further, that which led to his many social and monetary successes. He committed, for instance, to an avid system of reading and record keeping, and that broad and deep knowledge, including his multilingual talents, appealed to his many audiences. Combine this erudition with the skill set of an entrancing conversationalist who could balance showing off his vast learning with active listening and asking questions. An opportunist at heart, moreover, he befriended persons on all sides of the political continuum. And this is a good representation of that, right? This famous art historian, Conci, said that Miranda is no longer a man of one country. He has become a sort of common, inviolable property. Yet Miranda did not warm up to everyone he encountered. He was critical of the austere martial virtues that he detected in George Washington, for example, or the coxcomb ways he perceived in someone like Edward Gibbon. Miranda's allure involved four additional components of interest here. First, there is something to be said about the privileges of being charismatic and persuasive. The Russian Empress would support him financially and politically, just as several others across the Atlantic lent him money to back him and his cause. Second, Miranda often tried to practice inclusivity and sometimes to a fault. In 1790, he imagined a transcontinental Atlantic alliance between England, the US, and Latin America. His vision for an emancipated Colombian continent, this was his phrase, would be governed by two heads of state, two Incas, and one would concern himself with domestic affairs, and the other would be a perpetually globe-trotting ambassador. Third, Miranda inspired other people to imagine him in any way they wanted. He was this chameleonic shapeshifter, a Venezuelan Proteus who could be anything to anyone. Let me show you just a few slides here. This is a quote from Napoleon. I dined today at the home of a remarkable man. I believe him to be a spy of both England and Spain. He lodges on the third floor and is furnished like a satrap. He is a Don Quixote, but he's not mad. It is General Miranda. That man has a sacred fire in his soul. And here were just the different hats he wore throughout his life. And here are all the different ways that he was written about or identified throughout his life, whether that was himself or like other people, or other people writing about him. And like Byron, and and sorry, these are all of the cultural identities that Juin shifts through and navigates throughout Byron's poem too, which of course are very similar. And what I wanted to suggest is that like Byron, as Byron later would become, Miranda could not be pinned down. And this is a New York Times article from April 2024, this year, that's writing about Byron's bicentenary. Finally, the final point I want to make is that Miranda struck the balance between being a perpetual outsider as well as an insider. As V.S. Naipaul wrote, Miranda was the first South American of culture people in the US and Europe had met. As such an educated and well-traveled outsider, he remained elusive, non-committal, and he was able to ensure others' interest in him. But as an insider, which he achieved in most spaces he visited, he could forge his own pertinence. I would propose then that this combination, including his tactics at conversing and convincing, made him one of the ultimate agents of resistance of his age. He was unable to be pinned down. Even after his death, Miranda retained that elusive spirit, being laid to rest in an unmarked grave in a Spanish graveyard up to today. By way of conclusion, I'd like to consider his life of resistance vis-a-vis certain scholarly and theoretical frames. Naipaul called him little more than a confidence man in his historical novel, Away in the World, and I find that too reductive. Jocelyn Almeida has characterized Miranda as a hemispheric American who operated within pan-Atlantic space, a pan-Atlantic space of multiple centers. Meanwhile, she's often interested in reading Miranda according to white intellectual history, writing, for instance, that Miranda's border crossing with Rousseau in his tour of the United States, reveals the passage from Enlightenment to Romanticism in the Atlantic as an unfolding cultural process across several geographies and languages. I feel we can do better than align him with such European models. A little less delimiting is Jorge Cañizares Esquerra's notion of Creole epistemology, which emphasizes what Walter Mignolo has called border gnosis, right? The knowing that occurs on the edges and fringes. And perhaps most helpful is Srivanas Aravamudan's idea of a tropicopolitan. As he writes, in many historical instances, tropicopolitans, the residents of the tropics, the bearers of its marks, and the shadow images of more visible metropolitans, challenge the developing privilege of Enlightenment cosmopolitans. Aravamudan gets at this tricky negotiation between resistance and collusion. But as I've stated, Miranda did not operate strictly from the tropics. He was an insider enlightened cosmopolitan too, who avowed and disavowed such a position when it best suited. Yet, like Equiano, he also spoke and wrote back to empire. In my work, I'm using the frame of celebrity in order to try to rehistoricize Miranda's way in the world as Naipaul would have it. I'm specifically using the term global celebrity in reference to Miranda's influence on the world stage, with figures like Germaine de Stael and Byron drawing on his model of fame for two of the most popular literary works in Europe during the 19th century. This is one of the major arguments of my book in progress. This global celebrity allows me to focus on the chameleonism that fascinated Byron and led him to model his masterpiece on the Venezuelan. I want to suggest that through his life, writings, and writings about him, a South American Hispanic celebrity from the colonial periphery fundamentally influenced an industry typically understood as having European origins. The analysis also gives me some presentist liberties when I invoke, for instance, recent criticisms of the Hollywood industry that are not sufficiently diverse or not justly acknowledging the work of artists of color in the academy. My work shows how the roots of this industry at the exact moments when someone like Byron profoundly changed its course was a multicultural, multiracial phenomenon from its very inception. And I'd like to say this whole panel is really arguing that, isn't it? In my understanding, Miranda's global celebrity was both collaborative and speculative. Throughout his many spheres of influence, the Venezuelan Proteus reinvented himself and was reinvented by many others' whims and desires. It was a co-creative phenomenon, and it helped that a burgeoning media machine across the Atlantic world helped to circulate his varying masks. In terms of the speculative, this celebrity form allows us to imagine a future and unprecedented possibilities based on a protean object, an outsider figure of genius who can flourish because and not despite difference, one whose real power is that of evanescence. In terms of Miranda, such a Venezuelan subject could be molded and adapted into any kind of non-mimetic fiction, which is the way the genre of speculative fiction gets classified today. Miranda survived and thrived through manifestations beyond his control. He transformed himself and was transformed by others. This celebrity was malleable and one of the main subjects of Byron's poem on celebrity. Finally, and here I'm concluding, the field of celebrity studies is also quite helpfully relatively new and interdisciplinary. I think disciplines such as politics, history, literary studies, sociology, and others must be drawn upon to do my study justice. Persona studies, for instance, right? Or persona as method is a branch of celebrity studies, for instance, right? And you know, it goes without saying, critical theory is another site for auspicious framing, especially any kind of decolonial theory that breaks the center-periphery model or catalyzes heterogeneous, interactive, if historically fraught Caribbean space. Possibilities for Miranda also include notions of diasporic cosmopolitanism and translocality. I also take a cue from Stuart Hall's notion of cultural identity as one of becoming, wherein Hall identifies the ruptures and discontinuities which constitute precisely the Caribbean's uniqueness. Glissant's poetics of relation and globality are also germane, of course, especially as they stem from Deleuzian rhizomatic models. And here's the full quote from Fanon with which I started, and I just wanted to read it. I'm not a prisoner of history. I should not seek there for the meaning of my destiny. I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence. In the world through which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself. And Sylvia Wynter has really taken leaps from this very quote also. So I think both of these critics are becoming very important for the kinds of work I'm hoping to achieve. And here's my final paragraph. Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul wanted to base a film on Miranda's life, one that would focus on the lives of Christopher Columbus, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Miranda in equal measure. Unfortunately, no one created such a motion picture because Miranda has mostly been forgotten, even to some degree in the vast Hispanophone world, if you can believe it. Such misremembering is the case, even though there are 20 plus statues and monuments to Miranda that exist all over the world. A couple of months ago, for instance, I personally found a statue of him in Patras, Greece, that acknowledged him as the first American to visit Hellenic lands, the first American to visit Greece. It's incredible. And still, on the whole, he's been forgotten. And I'm also interested in this idea of how he moved from the spotlight into the shadows. In his case, perhaps when you try to please everyone, you please no one. When you try to be everything, you become nothing. As Byron described his first Byronic hero, Childe Harold, the knight in training was neither the best nor the worst of men. And my speculation, fittingly enough, is that such oscillations have their price. Being centrist, moderate, remaining in the middle cancels you out. It banishes you to a circle of hell that Dante never wrote about, that of historical oblivion, the one that even applies to that ultimate agent of protean resistance that Byron found 5 years later, 5 years time to write about. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Miranda, Omar Miranda, and also Professor Cassandra Smith. And thank you, Professor Kerry Sinanan, for having invited me to join this very important conversation. So my intervention is not going to be as thorough and as complex as those of my predecessors, because I'm coming back to these discussions after a hiatus. I've been like wandering onto Black radicalism. My second book project dealt with Black radicalism in the 20th century, especially during the first part of the 20th century, while my first book dealt with Phyllis Wheatley, early sources of Pan-Africanism. Wheatley, Ottobah Kugoano, Mary Prince, and the others. So this conversation provides me with an opportunity to get back, to the kind of questions I used to study, the good stuff. So I was really excited when I was invited to, and I'm still am, to participate in the conversation. And I started, my initial idea or project was to compare the ways in which the character of Olode Ekiano has been represented in the BBC's 2005 documentary, about him, and also, in fact, that one was entitled "The Extraordinary Ekiano," and then with the ways in which Ekiano has been represented in Michael Apted's 2007 film entitled Amazing Grace. And the reason why I'm interested in Amazing Grace is because it features one of the most famous singers in Senegal, popular musicians, whose name is Youssou N'Dour. We know Youssou N'Dour for having collaborated with that very wonderful album with Nene Cherry, right, in the 1990s. And also for having collaborated with Peter Gabriel, the British rock and roll stars. So Youssou N'Dour is a celebrity in itself. So the fact that he was selected to really play the role of Ekiano in Amazing Grace, I think I find revealing. So I was really trying to find ways of looking at how both films center on Ekiano's status as a formerly enslaved person who used any possible advantage afforded to him to seek to change both his conditions and the plight of blacks in Africa and the diaspora. So my goal was also to compare the two films with Ekiano's 1789 written narrative. So the more I was thinking about it, the project was becoming more complex. Then I said, well, okay, hopefully it would help bridge the media and literary representations of this very important figure in the history of Pan-Africanism and Black cosmopolitanism. Then I realized that I was really intending to work on too much of a project. So as I started to look at the literature review, I started to say, hold a second, why don't I just like focus on the literature review first? Understand, what these various scholars who are attempting to represent Ekiano as a celebrity are saying, you know, like to know the story, first of all, and kind of find my own voice in the conversation. Because that's how I do scholarship. I first of all try to find what's out there. And as I was trying to find what's out there, I became really intrigued, and some of the discussions kind of led me back to my first impressions as soon as I came out of grad school. I got my PhD in 2002 from Bowling Green State University, and I do remember in those early years, like I think probably 2004 or 2005, I was invited to participate in a colloquium at Harvard University on the Black Atlantic. It was called the Early Black Atlantic kind of seminar. And I remember the great Bernard Bailyn, very famous professor of Harvard was there attending. And there was like this other major scholar by the name of David Barry Gaspar, right, who teaches, I think, at Duke. I think that's the way he is at, was there. And interestingly, or more interestingly, Vincent Carretta was there, and he was presenting his book, Ekiano the African, or at least like some of the material that went to that book. So he was kind of giving a teaser. It was a teaser. And he talked about, that was the first time I heard this whole notion that Ekiano, that he had he Carrera had some naval evidence and medical evidence and other types of military evidence and written reports demonstrating that Ekiano might not have been born in Africa, right? That he might have been born, like he was born in South Carolina. So that was interesting, and the debate was really intense. And over the years, I've always wanted to really work around those subjects. The whole question of authenticity and how Ekiano's persona has been created. Who has a right to even represent Ekiano? Who even has a right to, and how much leeway do we have as critics, as scholars, to really represent Ekiano in certain fashions and in certain manners? So, as I started to really work on, my intervention today, I found Carrera's really book to be important. I mean, in the literature, and my understanding is that one of the first scholars to really examine Ekiano's role and status as a celebrity may be Vincent Carrera. At least who could be a pioneer, I would argue, in the study of the Black author's use of his public persona and book as means of self-promotion. And he argues, he himself, a character in the book, Ekiano the African, biography of a self-made man, that the reception the public and viewers have of the interesting narrative and its author prove that Ekiano had certainly not thrown his jewels of instruction away. Carretta continues, he, Ekiano, quickly took advantage of additional ways to distribute those jewels. Interest in abolition led to many public debates on the topic. Debating societies gave authors the opportunity for 18th century equivalent of 21st century promotional appearances on television. So he's equating Ekiano's celebrity in the late 18th century with the fact of being a celebrity in 21st century America or Western world. Some of the societies were restricted by gender, he argues. Coretta also writes, Ekiano very quickly became the first person of African descent people thought of when they imagined a black speaker. So that's interesting. And we may ask why. He continues, combined with a celebrity Ekiano had worked so hard to achieve, the presence of publishers on his subscription list guaranteed that book reviewers would do not ignore his autobiography. The reviews, though mixed, were generally favorable. End of quotation. So, part of the literature that establishes connections between Ekiano and the idea of a celebrity focuses on the fact that he underwent a radical transformation from being just an individual who took his own personal moral positions against slavery to becoming the representative of a larger moral cause. That is a symbol of the resistance of a growing number of England's population against bondage. In the section entitled Making a Name for Himself, the interesting narrative of his book that is called Beyond Slavery and Abolition, Black British Writing, 1770-1830, published in 2018, the critic Ryan Henley explains something interesting, that we should also consider in our discussion of Ekiano's status as a celebrity. Henley writes, a number of Ekiano's decisions about how to publish and promote his work suggests that he thought to accrue a degree of personal fame as an abolitionist, intellectual, and spokesperson for Black people, both free and enslaved. Indeed, the publication of the narrative reflected a radical shift in the public persona. Before November 1788, Ekiano had been exclusively known as Gustavus Vasa, an essentially private individual. He had become well known in London because of his public service, intelligent interjections, and in the abolition debates and leadership of grassroots Black political activism. But he was not, or at least did not consciously try to be, the embodiment of anything beyond himself. However, Henley argues, when he, Ekiano, began to solicit subscriptions to pay for the publication of his autobiography, a schism of his identity became apparent. On one hand, Gustavus Vasa remained a major player in the abolitionist movement, exercising personal influence and taking a leading role in its networking and petitioning functions. On the other, a new figure emerged, Oloda Ekiano. This figure was charisma as a commodity. Ekiano was much more than a brilliant author. He was a figurehead of popular abolitionism, a living demonstration of the moral indefensibility of enslaving fellow human beings, and an avatar of the wrongly enslaved. Readers could hear him speak in person, reach out and touch him, and in so doing, become a part of the movement and the art he represented. In exchange for the price of a book, they could understand and, in a sense, participate in the life of an enslaved human being. Importantly, by investing financially in Ekiano's through the purchase of his book, readers could also perform their own humanity, proclaiming to the world their emotional and moral sensitivity and their commitment to freedom and equality. I find this reading of Ekiano's, I would say, uh, status of being sandwiched between a form of representative of himself, of an individual who was private, doing his work and representing some limited extent of Black leadership. And on the other hand, an Ekiano that represented a grander, a bigger, larger moral cause. Very interesting, so it represents some kind of duality, right? We talk about double consciousness a lot, and I think there's definitely some schism, two-ness, the act of going in two directions that Ekiano represented. in his status as a celebrity, but also as an individual. Another argument that I find really relevant, which is critical, comes from the scholar narratives testimonial transactions published in 2015, that there is would suggest that there is a different take that one can have on the relations between Equiano and celebrity. I like Whitlock's a lot, uh, above the others that I have mentioned so far, because it seems more historically accurate. Whitlock seems to represent celebrity as problematic, since it may be under the gaze or the manipulation of the onlooker who has the power to determine another subject's success or failure based on the power of testimony. So this was a power that the former or newly enslaved mostly lacked. It was the whites that had the power to testify. Another problem, as Whitlock seems to insinuate, is a transactional nature of testimony itself. And I'm going to explain what she means by just quoting her. She writes, testimonial transactions are transnational and transcultural, embedded in global networks of traumatic memory and witness, campaigns for social justice, reconciliation, and reparation. Later on, a few paragraphs later, she writes, the intellectual and emotional convergences that empower testimony are tenuous, threshold that terminate and evaporate, becoming meaningless and unintelligible. End of quotation. Therefore, celebrity can be problematic when it depends on the power of another person's testimony, since the latter, that testimony itself, may be transactional, therefore depending on subjective judgment and temporality. Another reason why Whitlock's reading is uniquely significant in our discussion is because it helps explain the importance of the fame and celebrity that has been built around Equiano since the late 20th century, especially in England. Like all of a sudden, I mean, since the late 20th century, increasingly, of course, after the publication of Carter's phenomenal book, there is an increasing interest in representing Equiano as a celebrity. How about the others? How about Cugoano? Why wasn't Cugoano a celebrity, and why is Equiano one? And this is what Whitlock explains on this topic. She writes, colonial testimonial narratives remain potent and proximate still, and they are mobilized variously in the colonial present as heritage. For example, the 2007 commemoration of the 1807 Act of Parliament to abolish the slave trade in Britain features Oloda Equiano as a celebrity. He was, as James Walvin remarks, ubiquitous. At the exhibition dedicated to Equiano at the Birmingham Museum of Art Gallery late that year, the visitors' first encounter was with the Equiano suits made by the Hockey Youth Project during the Culture Club's activities associated with the exhibition. One of these suits of many colors suggests the renewed currency of Equiano's image now. The fame and fortune Equiano gained gave us the idea to put him onto paper money like the Queen. Lots of us designed and made money, and in the end, we had so much we could cover an entire suit. A number of these artworks associate Equiano with wealth and fortune, and his ability to make money from things others regarded as worthless. For the participants in the youth project, he is a wheeler dealer. We dream about being able to make our fortune like Equiano. This owes less to the narrative, with its call for social justice and testimonial on behalf of the enslaved, than to the entrepreneur who buys his freedom and purchases a suit to celebrate. This version of Equiano is a creation of a biography. Vincent Carretta's Equiano the African, biography of a self-made man, translated into the argot of contemporary youth culture in Birmingham. It is nonetheless a testimony to the opportunism and agency of this autobiographical subject, and its capacity to renew agency through remediation and appropriation from text to textile. End of quotation, very long quotation. Whitlock's interpretation makes perfect sense since it allows us to understand the significance that fashion, especially the images of the suits that the Senegalese singer Youssou N'Dour, who portrays Ekiano in the 2006 film Amazing Grace, adorns. Here, we see how well-tailored suits embody the idea of professional, social, and economic uplift that fame brought to Ekiano, but also the whole idea that there is something a bit extraordinary in the whole history. What is odd is that the character of Ekiano in the film barely speaks up, despite the fact that he is understood to represent somebody who is famous and an advocate for social justice. This is at odds with the whole idea of celebrity that the scholars have generally theorized about Ekiano. In the film Amazing Grace, Ekiano is depicted as somebody who generally use his clout to try to garner support against slavery, but he is not portrayed as somebody who is fundamentally an entrepreneur. Instead, the film shows him as a person who could barely speak, not due to fear, but probably because of the unspeakability of the brutality of slavery that words alone could not represent. There is an episode in the film Amazing Grace in which a group of well-to-do British people, probably including parliament representatives and other officials, were invited by a white speaker to smell the odor emanating from a slave ship. Almost all the white onlookers who had been enjoying a meal covered their noses immediately and incrementally removed their hands as the speaker, who was probably an abolitionist advocate, helped them understand how the smell represented the daily lives of human beings who were subjected to the most horrible plight by other human beings for months, even if most of them died during the Middle Passage. So Amazing Grace's representation of Ekiano and slavery in these terms help show that the portrayal of Ekiano's significance vis-a-vis his celebrity status can be sometimes problematic when it is devoid of the radicalism that the author and the leader expresses in his narrative. The risk is to whitewash the book by simply perceiving Ekiano mainly as a self-made man rather than a social and human justice revolutionary. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I've got pages written down here. Thank you so much, each of you. I'd love to know if you'd like to ask each other any questions or follow up on some of the amazing connections and questionings of celebrity and what it means to be everybody and nobody and mobile and also stuck, of being free and enslaved, all these contradictions that you've captured so beautifully in the global Black Atlantic world. Um, who has a question for whom?
I think I may not have a question per se, as much as an observation that might actually turn into a question. I don't know. One thing that I found really, first of all, like I thank you to Omar for introducing me to Francisco de Miranda. Like absolutely fascinated by all the details and the the moment about Wheatley and the like mind blown. Like I want to know more. One thing I found interesting, as I listened to you and as I listened to Babacar, I was thinking more about like, what people of color, can rise to this kind of celebrity status and who can't. And one thing that kept coming back that was clear to me, both in Francisco de Miranda, and in Equiano, was this idea of charisma. And I think at one point you may have been quoting Babacar from Coretta or from somebody else when you were talking about charisma as a commodity itself. And so I was just wondering, like, if we could talk a little bit more about how that particular quality, which in a lot of ways is intangible, you can't precisely define it, but you know it when you see it, right? So just kind of thinking more about what it was that Equiano may have done that would signal charisma, and the same thing with Francisco de Miranda, and then thinking about, like, I'm just trying to figure out like how charisma works, like this quality, like it's so powerful that in some ways it threatens to, not threatens to, but it can like override some of these other, really oppressive systems that are at work. But of course, in other ways, we know that it doesn't. So I don't know, just wondering if we could spend a couple minutes just talking about this quality of charisma as central to celebrity.
Thank you. I was equally struck by both of your presentations on Equiano, and just the number of overlaps and parallels is just absolutely fascinating. And I was really fascinated by your ideas of respectability, and I'm also very interested in this idea of charisma. And I agree, I don't think we can define it, but we know it. And I think this is why I brought up that story of Ezra Stiles.
Yes.
I think that is charisma, right? That he could insult Yale University. The fact that he was able to get a visit to Yale University.
Mhm.
The fact that the president was taking him on a walking tour of, and that Miranda just goes into this library and says, "This is a mediocre collection." That's one of my favorite stories ever in the world. I love that. It just, that makes me smile. And I think that's in some ways charisma, and I'm struck that it seems, I agree with you. I think Equiano had it too. It seems to me also that Equiano, based on Babacar, what you were saying, also had this notion of various personae that he's inhabiting and embodying, and his biographers are also sort of selecting which personae they want to foreground. And I love that you said, and I don't know if it was intentional, whitewashing. I think that's great. It's just how do we how did they present themselves? How do we present these individuals? Gosh, so much to say. Please, I'll stop for now.
You're on mute, Babacar.
Yeah, it happens
You're
to
on
me all
mute.
the time. Yeah, here we tend to like silence ourselves a lot here at my campus. So yeah, I found your both of your presentations fascinating. I just wanted to say that. So when I was mentioning that whole idea of charisma, I was referring to Ryan Henley's book, um, Beyond Slavery and Abolition, Black British Writing, 1770, 1830. And he was saying in the middle of that quotation that I read that on one hand, Gustavus Vassa remained a major player in the abolitionist movement, exercising personal influence and taking a leading role in its networking and petitioning functions. On the other, a new figure emerged. Olode Equiano, the figure was charisma as a commodity. Equiano was much more than a brilliant author. He was a figurehead of popular abolitionism, a living demonstration of the moral indefensibility of enslaving fellow human beings as an avatar of the wrongly enslaved. So that's the power of charisma that he had. And I think even the film version of Equiano's narrative, that Amazing Grace, does represent that, even with his silence. The character of Yusundur really is able to draw a huge segment of the British population to recognizing that there is something indefensible, about enslavement. That there needed to be a change in the society, a moral change, a societal change, a communal change, and we could feel that. But I think like so maybe it's only by connecting the two texts, like the filmic and the literary representation, and putting them in conversation with each other, that we can really excavate these themes, uncover the connections between the representation of commodity or celebrity in both texts. No, but something that I wanted to say to build off on what you talked about was especially what Omar was saying around celebrity, the problematic nature of even representing Equiano as a celebrity, and the power that people have, that the person, the critic has to decide, right, what how to frame this whole discussion uh, uh, had to do with Carrera, so he is like a person that really owns, I would say, the literary representation of Equiano, right? So he's a pioneer. That's what I mean. Like he's a pioneer in that field. And you probably notice like Whitlock's jibe, right, at Carrera in that quotation that I read, right? That when Whitlock insinuates that this whole notion that Equiano is more of a celebrity than anything else, it derives from Carrera's book. And I don't think she means it negatively, but it just brought me back to that early tension that I had felt in that colloquium at Harvard, in the ways in which David Barry Gaspar responded. It was really intense. It was the room was hot, but Carrera stood his ground. He was like, "Yeah, the records are showing it. There's nothing we can, deny. This is science and objectivity versus whatever people want to say about Equiano, right? But this is what the what the history says, and over time, I would say Carreta has prevailed, right? Because it was in 2005 that documentary was made, the documentary of BBC on Equiano, and Carreta was one of the critics, to really comment on that documentary, to be interviewed by, I think probably British television. I'm not sure if it was BBC itself, but I do remember hearing him and a number of other scholars. I think Alasdair Pettinger might have been one of them. Talk about Equiano in this framework, like in the ways in which now it is quite popular to talk about Equiano as a celebrity, and I'm not discounting those representations. I think they're meaningful, they're important, because these Black Atlantic leaders and intellectuals and writers, they were cosmopolitan, in essence, and even without paying too much attention on like to how critics are forcing uh, an interpretation of Equiano as a celebrity. Even without doing that, even before even I started to do that, by just reading the narrative, I could feel that Equiano was a self-made man. From my early reading of that book, the interesting narrative, you could tell that this person owned himself. Like he had a certain freedom, a certain way with the world, a certain status of being a citizen of the world. Like it is in the text, but there is something troubling, I think, in I mean what I would call almost like a I don't know, an engineered, kind of fabricated, and this kind of obsessive attempt to really make us see Equiano in certain ways that I think the real character or the representation of the real character in the book resists. So all of these, I think, are part of the debate. We should bring all of these onto the table to really have a holistic understanding of Equiano's complexity.
Yeah. And one thing that I'm going to say, going to your idea, going to your comments about celebrity status, about Coretta and his biography, and just like asking us to talk for a moment about what we mean when we say celebrity. Because I mean, for sure, Equiano, if we're just thinking colloquially, like when we use the term in everyday language, I think that Equiano had a certain kind of celebrity status in his own time. So, we didn't need like Coretta in 2000, it didn't just happen in 2005 with Coretta, right? So, and this is one of the things that I find really interesting as a difference between Equiano and Miranda, both of whom seem to have a whole lot of charisma as they're moving around globally. But Miranda falls out of the public notice, right? Like he falls into obscurity. With Equiano, insanely popular. Like the time, like I think his narrative goes through, is it like 9 editions or something in the span of like 10 years? But so, and like we know, a lot of that has to do with the slave trade and the abolitionist movement and whatnot. And then he does fall out of public notice for like maybe a century or so. Then mid 20th century, scholars pick him back up. But like so, two things interesting here. Do we think differently about what celebrity looked like in like 1790 versus what it looks like now, or what we mean when we use it in 2024? And then the second thing is, what is it about Miranda and his life story that makes it maybe more difficult to resurrect him? And I wonder if it has something to do with what Babacar was just talking about with the text. Like we have this constructed narrative of Equiano. He's definitely creating this story about a self-made man. Like, is that the thing? Like, does Miranda, like you mentioned, Omar, that he has a journal? I think, like, does he have some constructed narrative that he left behind that kind of shapes an image that carries on? So like just those two thoughts.
Yeah, no, this is great. Let me try to respond really quickly. Thank you for all of that. Yes, so he has 63 volumes. He was obsessed with
Oh,
himself.
Jesus.
63 volumes that he carried all over the world with him and had people carry with him. And then
Are you serious?
this archive is vast, and it was lost for a century, and it was only discovered at the beginning of the 20th century. Some very enterprising American scholar found his archive in the middle of nowhere in Britain and repatriated it to Venezuela. So now Venezuela
Mm,
has Miranda's 63 self-constructed volumes. It's absolutely
fantastic.
incredible, as if he was writing to the future, and collecting for the future. So there's that. There's the argument I want to make, and it goes back to comments that both of you have said, and like what Babacar has said about the dangers of celebrity and the subjective judgment, which really struck a chord with me. I I think, okay, two things about Miranda. We have his archive, his personal letters, and his diaries, which are fascinating about and created like 30 years before someone like what's his name, de Tocqueville, right? That we celebrate here in this country, right? But Miranda's writing 30 years before de Tocqueville about the entire early US Republican project. Anyway, and the argument I want to make is that there's another text that's about Miranda, and it's Byron's Don Juan, but that hasn't been acknowledged. And this goes back to that subjective judgment that passed over somehow into the scholarly discourse, right? It's like this story is like staring everyone in the face, but no one has actually written about the fact that Byron was writing about this historical figure. It was just staring at everyone. So I'm curious about, or I'm very interested in how the dangers of this subjective kind of gatekeeping and how it operates well beyond the time. And last thought is, yes, I agree. I think, having Equiano's narrative is obviously so important. And when we don't have an easy narrative to circulate from Miranda, it's hard to resurrect him, so to speak. I think that's lovely.
And so one real quick follow-up, like his 63 volumes, like is any of it transcribed, or like is it all in manuscript form?
They have a beautiful digital version of it at franciscodemiranda.org. All
Okay.
of his all of his papers are
It sounds like
there,
a
and
treasure trove.
it is. It is,
Wow,
and
okay.
he and it's all it's I think it's been digitally transcribed, and the thing is, because he was so multilingual, you find it in any language. So what's beautiful about studying him is that Spanish-speaking scholars can't lay claim to him any more than French scholars can, or English-speaking scholars, because he was using all three languages
Wow.
in so many powerful ways.
It makes me, I want to just jump in, it makes me think of the loss of language for Equiano and Wheatley and Cugoano, that they are forced to be monolingual, just as you're talking. And could I just pop in and say, with your question Babacar about why is Cugoano not a celebrity. The irony is that, of course, the portrait that's often used to represent Equiano it's not the same man who's on the frontispiece at all, who looks entirely different. And in fact, we think that that is anyway. This is likely Cugoano, who looks like a very self-made man and very polished and ready to be a celebrity if somebody wanted to make him one. I just wanted to pop that in there.
I had a question for Cassie. Cassie, if you wanted to say anything else about respectability, I was really intrigued by that term and how you seem to use it for Equiano, but also for the various marginal characters that you brought out in the book, which I thought were absolutely fascinating. So could you tell us more about how this respectability works? And I just think that's also a term that can be applied in some ways to Miranda. And I'm wondering if it's a term that he used only sparingly with certain people. Like what creates this respectability? How can we recognize it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, like that's coming from the second book as well, right? So like my whole what initially made me interested in Equiano is like a lot of the same stuff that you point out with Miranda is that how they channel that charisma into a certain kind of comportment that can be read, that can be interpreted in these in these different cultural contexts, right? So with what you were talking about with Miranda, right? He can be in this Spanish setting and he can behave in a certain kind of way, and he's read and he is accepted by that community. He can go up to Yale and he can comport himself. And so, like, what kind of libraries was he accustomed to visiting that he can make that judgment about Yale? I'm still fascinated by that. But anyway, so the idea about respectability is that, it becomes this strategy for adaptation
Yes.
as you're moving. In fact, like the very fact that Equiano is global, that kind of makes it necessary to adopt these various strategies of respectability, because like he couldn't go into these spaces and be accepted into those spaces if he didn't behave, like if he didn't adopt a particular set of mores that were acceptable to those various communities. So when I'm thinking about this idea of respectability, what I find really ironic, and I mean, I do make the argument that Equiano himself is arguing that respectability is a problematic strategy. But you have these other Black characters at the margins of the narrative who are behaving in ways that are presumably respectable, but they don't have the same payoff that they do for Equiano. And so you have to ask why that is, right? Why is it that Equiano can learn all of these mercantile practices and sell goods, save up enough money to buy his freedom, but yet his counterparts, his companions, can't do the same thing. And so anyway, just thinking about the complexities of respectability as a strategy that seems to work, but at the same time it really fails to do what it's designed to do.
It's really fascinating. One quick follow-up. It seems like something we can't often talk about is like the privilege of personality. It sounds like he was just able to finesse certain situations that his counterparts couldn't. I think that's the same with Miranda. He was just able to get people to loan him money and get people to believe in his cause, and it allowed him to just travel all over the world and get to the Empress of Russia.
Yeah.
It's incredible, but I think it's hard to talk about these things. And I don't know if you both would agree with me. It's hard to talk about the privilege of personality. It's because then we're talking about asymmetrical kinds of discourses, and it's an awkward conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think this points to the complexity of I would say radical narratives, So we really can't take out like Equiano or many Whitley or many of these other or let us say Miranda, right? We can't take them out of radicalism just because they espouse certain postures, like they appear as like people who drew on their celebrity status, their charisma, their sense of respectability to garner a certain type of freedom. I mean, of course, it will be likely to come to the works of critics that question, those kind of attitudes. You mentioned Omar, VS Naipo, right? Representing Miranda as a confidence man. I mean, to me, the term, the whole idea of a confidence man, that's problematic. But who isn't a confidence man? Confidence man goes with, capitalism, right? I mean, confidence man goes with like liberalism, right? Liberalism is for the most part based on the whole idea of a fabricated identity. I mean, none of it is necessarily genuine. Even abolitionism, is, I would say, built on some kind of constructedness, just like to borrow from Cassandra's term here of identity, so that I think, like, as critics, I think we are vulnerable, as critics of celebrity, as scholars of celebrity. We are trying to avoid engineering too much, you see, in such a way that we create our own version of this author, right? I have sometimes the impression that there are constructed images of Equiano. Why is Equiano so special? You see, how about the others? Right? I mean, he wasn't the only one. I mean, first of all, his character saying, "Hey, Keanu wasn't born where you was thinking that he was." No, he was. So in fact, so the whole enterprise does involve some relativity. Yeah. Uh, and another problem is the whole idea of elitism. I remember when I used to start to work on Phyllis Wheatley. I would, and then when you read Amiri Baraka's, right? Amiri Baraka's, takes, right, on Phyllis Wheatley, as opposed to, let's say, the positions of other scholars about her, uh, you realize that there is this ongoing perception, it's kind of diluted now, that Phyllis Wheatley had a privilege that was denied to many thousands, like, of blacks. You see, that in a sense, like, Phyllis Wheeler has an elitist position. So in a sense, one can even come up with a similar argument about Equiano.
I hate to interrupt. This is with so much more to say. Unfortunately, I think a couple of people have to go to other meetings, but all of that, I think that point to end with, that we cannot take the radicalism out of these figures just because they're needed for other causes, is really, really important. And as somebody who worked in the UK as abolition in 2007 was rising, I think Equiano's celebrity status was definitely part of that, identity politics need to have a black figure in what became really Wilberfest as well. It was entirely whitewashed abolition, the remembering of abolition. So listen, thank you so much for this rich, rich conversation, which I think has led to the need to have more rich conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.